Okay, so get this right. We're going deep on a Supreme Court case today, and it's a doozy, City of Grants Pass versus Johnson.
Right.
It all boils down to, can cities actually stop homeless folks from sleeping in public?
Yeah.
It's heavy stuff, you know?
Huge issue.
Trying to balance compassion with keeping our cities safe, and man, it gets complicated.
Really complicated.
And you know, you've sent over just a mountain of info on this, so let's
yeah, happy to dig in.
let's unpack it all right?
So what's really fascinating here, right, is this case, it cuts right to the heart of the Eighth Amendment.
Yeah.
That whole cruel and unusual punishment bit. But we're not just talking about, like, the punishment itself, like the fines, the jail time.
Right.
We're talking about, can you even make it illegal to do something that, for some folks, is just, it's unavoidable.
You can't outlaw being homeless, right?
Right.
But making it a crime to just exist in public, that's
a whole
other can of worms.
Yeah.
So we've got these oral arguments, right, from April.
Right.
And it's like legal sparring, just at its finest.
Oh, yeah.
Grants passes over here saying, hold on, our ordinance, this is about conduct, this is about setting up camp, it's not about being homeless.
Right.
They're talking about public health, they're talking about safety, the whole 9 yards. And they're saying they need this rule to kind of encourage people to use shelters and services.
Okay. And this is where it gets really tricky.
Oh,
because the folks challenging this law are basically saying, look, if you have absolutely nowhere to go, sleeping outside, that's not a choice. That is survival.
right.
And punishing that, they say, that crosses the line. That is cruel and unusual. And it's almost like saying, you can't be poor here, you got to go be poor somewhere else. Which historically a tactic cities have tried, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Bus ticket out of town, problem solved or not.
Right.
Right.
Exactly.
And Justice Sotomayor brought that up.
And she did.
Specifically about Grants Pass.
Yeah, yeah.
But let's zero in on like one exchange that really highlights this whole dilemma for the city.
Right.
Justice Kagan, always sharp as a tack, asks the city lawyer point blank, could you criminalize the status of homelessness?
Boom.
It's the $1 million question.
It is, isn't it?
And the lawyer tried to sidestep it a little bit, talking about, well, our ordinance, it's about conduct. But Kagan, she pushed back hard, and she uses this example of someone who's alone, they have no shelter access, they're literally just sleeping with a blanket.
Right.
Can the city really call that a crime? That's not a campsite, that's necessity.
That's the question.
And here's where it gets even juicier. Justice Jackson jumps in with this hypothetical. What if a city bans eating in public?
Okay. I like where you're going with this.
Right.
Yeah.
On the surface, it's like, all right, that sounds neutral.
Logical, right.
Nobody wants, like, litter and pests. And
Right, right.
But Jackson's point is, when you apply that to people with no other option, it becomes a punishment for simply existing while poor.
Absolutely.
And it's just...
It's an intersection.
Yeah.
Where it gets really complicated.
And the city lawyer's like, well, there's a necessity defense under Oregon law.
Okay.
But then Kagan's like, okay, so what's your officer going to do? If there are literally no shelter beds and someone is just trying to sleep, are they getting a ticket or not?
Right.
And the lawyer kind of dodges it, you know,
Sure.
talking about police discretion, connecting people with services.
Which, to be fair, is important.
Right.
But
it's not addressing that fundamental question.
It doesn't get to the heart of it.
Yeah, of whether the law itself is even okay when used against people with no other options.
That's it. You hit it right there.
And this is where things get even more interesting, okay?
Okay.
The United States government, they weigh in on this case.
Oh, wow.
As Amicus curiae, which basically means friend of the court for those of you who, you know, don't speak legalese.
Little Latin there.
Exactly. And now, they're not picking sides exactly.
Okay.
But they are arguing that the government, they can't work around Robinson v. California.
Right. That landmark case.
That's the one.
Can't criminalize a status.
Yeah, you can't just say being homeless in and of itself is a crime.
Right.
So that's the city's position.
Okay.
We've got a little taste of the government's take, but we haven't even gotten to the respondents yet.
Right.
And trust me, their argument
where the rubber meets the road
is pretty compelling.
So the respondents are basically saying, look, Grants Pass, you're trying to have it both ways. You say you're targeting conduct, but we're saying it's really about just pushing homeless people out of sight.
Right.
Instead of actually, you know, dealing with the root causes of homelessness.
Yeah, it's easier to just hide the problem, right?
Exactly.
Sweep it under the rug.
And they're really leaning on that that Robinson v. California case we were talking about.
Yeah.
The one that says, hey, you can't punish someone for being addicted to drugs.
Right.
It's a status, not a crime.
Mm-hmm.
So the respondents are saying, homelessness, it's kind of similar.
Okay.
You can't punish someone for simply being homeless, especially when there's literally nowhere else for them to go.
Right. Right.
And they raise a really interesting point, too, about the fluid nature, right,
Okay.
of homelessness.
Mm-hmm.
It's not always permanent, right? People move in and out of homelessness.
Sure.
So if it's treated as a criminal status, you're essentially trapping people in a cycle that they might otherwise escape.
It's almost like once you're in, you're in.
Exactly. Exactly. And it can be really hard to break free.
Right. Now let's circle back to the government's position for a sec.
Okay.
Because it gets even more interesting.
Right.
They're suggesting these individualized determinations. Basically, you can't just blanketly punish every single person sleeping outside.
Okay.
You have to look at the situation. Do they have access to shelter?
Right.
Are there any other options available?
How do you put that into practice?
Exactly. Like,
Yeah.
are we really asking
You-
police officers to be social workers on top of everything else?
Police officers on the street having to do a full assessment
Yes.
of every homeless person they encounter.
Yeah.
That's
It sounds like a logistical nightmare.
a logistical nightmare, and that's probably why the government's position is so frustrating
Oh, totally.
on both sides.
Because grants pass is like, that's way too much to ask.
right.
And the respondents are like, but if you don't do that, you're criminalizing homelessness.
Exactly. It's a tough spot to be in.
Totally.
But in their amicus brief, the government points to the clearing of an encampment at McPherson Square in D.C. as a possible model.
Ooh, a local example.
Yeah, there you go.
Tell me more.
So in that case, you have the Park Service and the local government working together. They gave people 30 days notice that the encampment would be cleared.
Okay.
And during that time, they actually sent out social workers
Wow.
to connect people with services, shelter options, things like that.
Okay.
Now, not everybody went for it. Not everybody took them up on that.
Sure.
But it was a much more proactive
Right.
and I think a more humane approach
Okay.
than just,
Right. More carrot, less moving.
moving people along. Right.
Got
Exactly.
it.
Yeah.
But that sounds like it takes a ton of resources and coordination, which, let's be real,
Sure.
not every city has.
You're absolutely right. And that's, I think, one of the biggest hurdles when it comes to tackling homelessness. Right?
Yeah.
There's no magic solution.
Mm-hmm.
Resources are often stretched incredibly thin.
Right.
But the government at least seems to be suggesting that even with limited resources, there are ways to address this that don't involve criminalizing people for simply sleeping outside.
Mm. Okay, so where does that leave us? What's the bottom line here?
Well, the Supreme Court still hasn't made a decision, but based on those oral arguments, it's clear they are wrestling with some really thorny questions.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Totally.
On the one hand, you've got cities, and they're saying, look, we need to maintain order, we need to maintain safety.
Right.
On the other hand, you have people, and they literally have nowhere else to go.
It's such a tough situation.
It is.
And zooming out a bit, like their decision
Yeah.
will have like ripples nationwide.
Nice
Whatever they decide, that's the standard.
Sets a precedent.
Yeah. For how cities can and can't address this,
Huge.
we could see cities getting a lot more power to regulate what happens in these public spaces.
Potentially.
Even if it's, seems like they're targeting specific groups.
Right, and that's what makes this case so important. Right. It's not just about grants pass, Oregon.
Right.
This is about the fundamental rights of every American.
Every American, yeah.
Especially the most vulnerable among us.
This deep dive has been, like, full of aha moments. You know what I mean?
Yes.
We've got the city saying, we need this law.
Mm-hmm.
We've got the respondents saying, this law is unjust.
Right, sure.
And then we've got the government offering a potential solution that honestly might be more than many cities are equipped to handle.
It really exposes, I think, the tension between individual rights and societal needs, and there are no easy answers.
Before we move on, there were a few specific moments in those arguments that I found really interesting.
Okay.
Justice Kagan, always sharp as a whip, she asked if the city lawyer considered homelessness a fluid state,
Okay.
Like, is someone still homeless if they manage to find shelter for a day?
Interesting.
And the lawyer's answer, well, let's just say it didn't exactly inspire confidence.
Okay.
And then Justice Sotomayor brings up that whole bus ticket out of town thing.
Right, right.
Implying that Grants Pass might have a history of just shifting the problem instead of actually solving it.
Yeah, just moving it along.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And who could forget Justice Jackson's eating in public hypothetical?
Oh, that was a good one.
To me, that was like a real mic drop moment, you know?
Yeah.
It perfectly illustrated how these seemingly neutral laws can actually have very different impacts on people depending on their circumstances.
Yeah. And I thought Justice Gorsuch brought up some really important points, too.
Oh, totally.
He kept pushing the boundaries of what qualifies as cruel and unusual punishment.
Yeah, he was really trying to get
It
at
was persistent.
how far can cities go?
Yeah, exactly. Like, what are the limits here?
Right.
Yeah.
And then there was Justice Barrett's observation about this case being pre-enforcement.
Right.
We're not talking about someone who was punished after the fact for sleeping outside. This is about preventing it in the first place.
Which, if you think about it, adds a whole other layer of complexity to this. It's not just about whether a punishment is cruel and unusual, but whether the law itself is unconstitutional because it's stopping people from meeting their basic needs.
So much to unpack, so many different angles to consider, but you, dear listener,
Right.
are now armed with like the core arguments in this really complex and frankly really important case.
Yeah, this is big.
But here's the kicker, okay?
Okay.
The respondent's lawyer, she dropped a bombshell that might change everything. So we left off that cliffhanger, right? What was this bombshell the respondent's lawyer dropped?
Right, right.
Well, she pointed out that Grants Pass's ordinance.
Okay.
It actually uses the phrase, get this, for the purposes of a temporary place to live when they're defining camping. So when you combine that with their definition of camping, it basically means being homeless while sleeping with a blanket is illegal.
Wow.
They practically wrote being homeless right into the law.
It's a really clever point.
Right.
And it really kind of, I think, highlights the contradiction
Totally.
in the city's argument.
Yeah.
They're saying, we're not criminalizing homelessness, but their ordinance seems to say otherwise.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
And then there's this whole other question of how you even define harmlessness.
Right.
The lawyer for the respondent shares the Department of Housing and Urban Development's definition,
Sure.
which talks about lacking a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence.
Okay.
But even a few of the justices pointed out that's a pretty fluid thing.
It is.
Someone could be couch surfing.
Right.
They could be staying in a shelter for a little bit, or even living in their car.
Yeah, yeah.
Are they still considered homeless in those situations?
It's a good question, and it kind of goes back to that idea of
Right.
the individualized determinations we were talking about.
Yes.
How can a police officer realistically
Right.
make that kind of judgment call on the spot?
Yeah, it's way too much.
It could lead to inconsistent, potentially unfair enforcement.
Oh, absolutely. And then on top of that,
Yeah.
we have the question of pets.
Oh, right, right.
Justice Sotomayor, she brings up this hypothetical situation about a homeless person with a dog who can't find a shelter that'll take both of them.
Sure.
Is it cruel and unusual punishment to force them to choose between their pet and having a place to sleep?
Right, because for many people, their pets are family.
Absolutely.
It's a really tough situation to think about.
It is.
And I think it just really underscores how complicated this whole issue is.
Yeah, it is. It is.
The respondent's lawyer, I will say, she did argue that
Yeah.
the shelter is available, both practically and legally,
Okay.
that choosing not to go there because of a pet
Right.
falls outside of their argument.
Okay.
But it does make you think about, what we even consider adequate shelter
Right.
and whether those standards are flexible enough to accommodate all these different needs.
There's so much nuance here.
So much nuance.
And then we have this back and forth about the necessity defense.
Right, which we touched on earlier.
Yeah, so to put it simply,
There are folks who
for folks at home,
might not be familiar.
yeah, it's a legal argument that says it's okay to break the law if you absolutely have to,
Right,
in order to prevent something worse from happening.
right. If you're starving and you steal food to survive.
Right. That kind of thing. But the question here is, does that apply to homelessness? And if so, how?
Right, because that's where things get really murky, right?
Yeah.
Because the respondent's lawyer, she argued that Oregon does have a necessity defense,
Okay.
but the courts there, they haven't really used it in these homelessness cases yet. And even if they did, it wouldn't necessarily cover those fines and citations being challenged in this specific case.
So it's like it might be there, but it's not a
Right, it's not a slam dunk.
slam dunk.
It's not a foolproof solution.
Yeah.
especially with these very specific types of ordinances that we're talking about.
And it's important to remember, too, that this case isn't just about whether this particular punishment is cruel and unusual.
Right. This is bigger than that.
This is about whether the law itself is even constitutional.
Exactly.
Because it essentially criminalizes being homeless.
Even if it doesn't come right out and say it.
Exactly.
Okay. Which is fascinating, right?
Okay, so where do we stand now? What's the latest?
So the Supreme Court, they still haven't issued a ruling.
Okay.
But those oral arguments
right.
definitely gave us a lot to think about.
No. Yeah.
And it's clear the justices, they're divided on this issue.
Totally.
It's really anyone's guess how they'll rule.
So the big question is...
Now, what happens...
What if they side with Grant's Pass?
What happens if they uphold this ordinance?
Yeah.
Because that could give cities all across the country the green light to implement similar laws.
Right.
Just imagine a world where cities have way more power to regulate other basic human activities in public spaces. Eating, sitting, even just standing.
Yeah.
If they can argue some kind of a rational basis, even if those regulations, once again, disproportionately impact vulnerable populations.
That's certainly something to consider.
It is.
And it's, wow.
Yeah, big implications.
It's been a really eye-opening deep dive into this incredibly complex issue.
As always.
Thank you all for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And we'll be sure to break down the Supreme Court's decision as soon as it comes out.
Looking forward to it.
Until then, keep asking those tough questions.